3 days, 7 countries, 1,318 miles, 1 puncture, 1 burning lorry, countless mechanical dramas, very little sleep, and one purpose: to deliver vehicles to Ukraine. Vehicles that within days would be transporting medical supplies, evacuating wounded soldiers, and supporting people working close to the front. But when I set off from Britain, I thought this was going to be a story about the journey. I didn't realize it was going to change the way I saw Ukraine. Our journey began in a hotel car park on the outskirts of Banbury. One by one, volunteers arrived. Some were experienced convoy veterans, others, like me, were doing it for the first time. There were engineers, mechanics, business owners, retired professionals, people from completely different backgrounds who had come together for one simple reason: to take practical help to people who needed it. Outside, the vehicles were waiting. 4-wheel drives, pickups, an ambulance, a transit, a Volvo estate. At first glance they looked like ordinary second-hand vehicles, but they were about to begin very different lives. Some would become ambulances, some would carry supplies, others would support drone operators, air defense teams, or frontline logistics. That evening, though, none of us knew quite what was ahead. We just knew it was a long way east, and that we'd better get some sleep, because by dawn, the hotel car park had become an improvised workshop. Bonnets were open, engines were running. Tire pressures were checked, fluids were topped up, sat-navs were programmed. Even before we left, the vehicles were already giving us problems. Our Toyota Hilux had no screen wash. Another Hilux had a leak. It was nothing serious. But it was an early reminder that these were older vehicles, and older vehicles have personalities. By mid-morning we were ready. The briefing was complete. Radios were working, the route was planned, and Convoy 62 finally rolled out of Banbury. For the first few miles it felt like a road trip. We had no idea how quickly that feeling would disappear. England slipped behind us, then Dover, then France, then Belgium. The convoy settled into a rhythm. Motorways, fuel stops, coffee, radio conversations. At Dover, delays split the convoy between 2 ferry crossings. It was frustrating, but it also gave us time to talk. And gradually, the strangers who had met only the night before began becoming a team. Then, somewhere on a Belgian motorway, the trip changed. John and Natalie were travelling ahead of us in their Hilux when they hit a large piece of metal lying in the carriageway. The front tyre was destroyed almost instantly. Several of us pulled onto the hard shoulder. Tools appeared. An air compressor appeared, and suddenly we were doing what convoy volunteers apparently do best, trying to repair an aging Toyota at the side of a motorway. Then we noticed the lorry behind us. It had hit what appeared to be the same piece of debris. Within seconds, flames were pouring from beneath the cab. Black smoke climbed into the sky. Emergency services arrived, traffic slowed, and there we were. Behind us, firefighters fighting a burning lorry. In front of us, half a dozen volunteers changing a punctured tire. And somehow, despite the chaos, nobody panicked. We just got on with it. The jack didn't want to cooperate. The wheel nuts didn't want to come off. And eventually Owain and I were lying on the tarmac, covered in dirt, trying to persuade the Hilux to give up its wheel. It wasn't glamorous, but looking back, it probably captured the spirit of Convoy 62 better than anything else. Ordinary people. A difficult situation. Everyone simply finding something useful to do. Eventually the wheel was changed. The tools went back into the vehicles, and we carried on. There were still hundreds of miles to go. By the time we reached Krakow, it was late. Nearly 2 days had passed since leaving England. The vehicles were covered in road grime. The drivers were exhausted, and Ukraine was suddenly no longer an abstract destination somewhere on the other side of Europe. It was only a few hours away. The following morning felt different. The radios were turned down. Passport wallets appeared on dashboards, and as we approached the border, the scenery began to change. Blue and yellow flags appeared more frequently, and eventually we crossed into Ukraine. There was no dramatic moment, no announcement, just a barrier lifting, and then we were in. But something had changed. For 2 days, these vehicles had been our cargo. Now they were about to become something much more important. As we traveled deeper into Ukraine, we started finding out where the vehicles were going. One was destined for a medical battalion, another would become a mobile blood donation unit, others would support drone operators, air defense teams, and frontline logistics. One was replacing a vehicle destroyed by a Russian drone attack only days earlier. Suddenly, they weren't just second-hand vehicles that had spent their previous lives on British roads. They were ambulances without red paint, supply trucks without company logos, and quite simply, lifelines on 4 wheels. That changed the meaning of every mile we'd driven. For 2 days we'd worried about fuel, ferries, breakdowns, and motorway services. Now we understood what all those miles had really been for. Nothing quite prepared me for meeting the people who were collecting the vehicles. There were no elaborate ceremonies, just handshakes, smiles, conversations, and photographs beside vehicles that only hours later would be heading towards places we'd become familiar with through the news. Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk. The language barrier didn't really matter. Sometimes Google Translate helped. Sometimes it wasn't necessary. A handshake and a smile says a lot. And watching the keys change hands was one of the most moving moments of the journey. Until then the convoy had been about driving. Now it was about people. Before we left Lviv we visited the Field of Mars. It's a place that is difficult to describe. Rows upon rows of Ukrainian flags, each one marking the grave of someone who had died since the full-scale invasion began. Standing there, the scale of what was happening in Ukraine suddenly felt very different. Until that point we'd been focused on the vehicles, the miles we'd driven, the people we'd met, the practical things we were there to deliver. But here, there was no escaping the human cost behind the war. These weren't statistics, they were sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, partners, and friends. And I found myself thinking about the vehicles we'd just handed over. A pickup or an ambulance might seem like a small contribution in a war of this scale, but standing there, it became clear why they mattered, because behind every vehicle is a person. Someone who needs to get somewhere, someone who needs medical help, someone who needs supplies, someone who needs to come home. The Field of Mars was quiet, and after the noise and exhaustion of the convoy, that quiet stayed with me. Until then, the journey had been about getting somewhere. Standing there, I understood a little more about why we'd come, and then came a moment that changed my own journey completely. After the official handover, John and Natalie invited me for a coffee with the people receiving their Hilux. That's where I met Petruccio. Before the full-scale invasion, he'd been a postman. His colleague had been a university student. They weren't career soldiers. They were ordinary people whose ordinary lives had been interrupted by extraordinary circumstances. My original plan was to take the train to Kyiv. Then Petruccio said, "We're driving back to Kyiv this afternoon. If you'd like, come with us." I didn't need much persuading. The convoy had reached its destination, but my journey through Ukraine was only just beginning, so I climbed into the Hilux, and we headed east. The drive to Kyiv gave us time to talk. We talked about work, family, Britain, Ukraine, and life before the war. The thing that struck me most was how ordinary their stories were. War interrupts ordinary lives, it doesn't erase them. Then as we approached Kyiv, the Hilux developed a diesel leak. Warning lights appeared on the dashboard. The engine began threatening to stall. We searched for tools. We found a couple of rusty spanners. Neither was the right size, and once again, a vehicle that was supposed to be delivering help was refusing to cooperate. Eventually I had to leave them to continue the repair themselves. My friend Vova came out of Kyiv to collect me. I said goodbye to Petruccio and his colleagues. Only later did I discover that they repaired the leak and carried on, all the way to the front lines near Zaporizhzhia. Vova took me to my apartment, then insisted that I have dinner with him and Marina. It was warm, friendly, normal. We talked about the convoy, family, friends, and life in Britain. Outside, Kyiv looked like a normal city. Cars moved through the streets. Cafes were open. People walked home. Couples sat together. It could have been almost any European city. Except that Vova kept checking his phone. Air raid information, drone activity, warnings. It was a quiet reminder that this was still a city at war. Then later that night, I discovered something I never expected. My phone suddenly came alive, an air raid warning. And then a familiar voice, the actor Mark Hamill, who played Luke Skywalker.
Attention! Air raid alert. Proceed to the nearest shelter. Don't be careless. Your overconfidence is your weakness. Attention! Air raid alert. Proceed to the nearest shelter. Don't be careless. Your overconfidence is your weakness.
Within seconds, Vova messaged me. "Are you okay? Then, do you know where to go?" I wasn't alone. The alert continued, and eventually another message came through, this time from Luke Skywalker again.
Attention! The air alert is over. May the Force be with you.
I couldn't help smiling. It was an extraordinary mixture of danger and humor, and somehow it captured what I was beginning to understand about Kyiv. The people there knew the danger was real, but they refused to let it consume every moment of their lives. The next morning, Kyiv felt surprisingly normal. Coffee, pastries, traffic, people going to work. We talked about ordinary things. Not missiles, not military operations, just life. Then Marina took me shopping for a vyshyvanka, traditional Ukrainian embroidered clothing. I tried several and eventually bought two. They weren't just souvenirs, they felt like a small connection to the country and its identity. Then we went somewhere even more unexpected. A supermarket, Le Silpo, and it was unlike any supermarket I'd ever seen. Beautifully designed, fresh food displayed almost like artwork. I was taking photographs of the fish counter. Vova laughed. You don't normally photograph supermarkets? No, not until that day. Then an air raid alert sounded. My instinct was to stop, but nobody else did. People carried on shopping. Staff carried on working. Children stayed with their parents. Because we were already underground, there was no panic. The alert was simply another interruption to daily life. And that's when I began to understand something. Resilience can look remarkably ordinary. As we traveled around Kyiv, I started looking beyond the obvious landmarks. There were reminders of the war everywhere. Sandbags, memorials, photographs of fallen soldiers, damaged buildings, but alongside them was ordinary life. Restaurants, shops, families, children, people meeting friends. Kyiv hadn't forgotten the war. It had simply refused to surrender every part of life to it. We visited the Kyiv Pechesk Lavra. Golden domes rose above the city. The monastery has watched over Kyiv for centuries. History here wasn't something confined to a museum. It was part of everyday life. And even here, the war had left its mark. Some areas had been damaged by Russian drone attacks. From the top of the bell tower, I looked across Kyiv. The Dnipro, the apartment blocks, the churches. For a moment, the city looked peaceful. Then we had lunch beside the river. Families were on the beach nearby. Children were swimming. People were playing volleyball. Nothing dramatic was happening. Later, we visited Independence Square. Burnt-out Ukrainian civilian and Russian military vehicles stood alongside information boards for visitors to read. A veteran was selling blue and yellow wristbands to raise money. I reached for my wallet, then realized I didn't have any Ukrainian currency. Without hesitation, Vova bought 3. 1 for me, and 2 for my sons. It was a small gesture, but I remembered it, because by this point I was beginning to see a pattern. People looking after people. Nothing seemed to be too much trouble. Nothing seemed to be treated as an inconvenience. Looking after one another seemed as natural as making a cup of tea. That evening we returned to Vova and Marina's apartment. There was food, conversation, laughter, friends, family. For a few hours. It could have been anywhere in Europe. Then Vova looked at his phone. There were warnings of another night of drone attacks, and Vova and Marina insisted that I shouldn't spend the night alone. So we went back to my apartment, collected my bags, and returned to theirs. The warnings proved accurate. During the night, the alerts sounded more than once. Phones buzzed, messages arrived, lights came on. Everyone knew what to do. Nobody panicked. Nobody rushed. They simply waited. Eventually, the all clear came. For me, it was an unusual night. For the people I was staying with, it was part of life. And that made me think about something I'd never really considered before. Wars are often measured in destroyed buildings, in casualty figures, in territory gained or lost, but perhaps they can also be measured in something much more ordinary: lost sleep. The next morning we had breakfast high above Kyiv. Looking out across the city, everything seemed calm. The Dnipro shimmered in the morning light. Church domes caught the sunshine. People drank coffee. Waiters moved between tables. It was difficult to reconcile that peaceful view with the alerts that had disturbed our sleep only hours earlier. But perhaps that contradiction was the story. The people of Kyiv lived with danger, but they refused to surrender to it. Later we visited the former residence of President Viktor Yanukovych, the Museum of Corruption. It was extraordinary. Gold leaf, chandeliers, lavish rooms, a vast estate, a monument to wealth and corruption. And then, after the tour, something completely ordinary happened. Vova and I hired electric bikes. His son Gosha climbed onto the back, and we cycled around the estate. For a little while the war felt very far away, and perhaps that's another thing I will remember, the ordinary moments. Eventually it was time to leave. Vova drove me back into Kyiv. We collected my luggage, and he took me to the railway station. There were no emotional speeches, no elaborate farewell, just hugs, handshakes, and promises to meet again. As I watched them drive away, I thought about how much my view of Ukraine had changed. I'd arrived expecting to learn about a country at war. Instead, I'd learned about friendship, generosity, and resilience. I'd seen the human cost of war. But I'd also seen people determined not to let the war define them. People getting up after another interrupted night, making breakfast, going to work, opening their shops, meeting friends, laughing, looking after strangers, carrying on. The overnight train eventually carried me back through Lviv, across Poland and towards home. 29 hours after leaving Kiev, I arrived back home. The journey was over, but it didn't really feel finished. I came home with photographs, memories. Two beautifully embroidered Vyshyvanka shirts and something less tangible, a different understanding of what resilience looks like. Before I went, I thought resilience meant strength in the face of adversity, something dramatic, something heroic. Now I'm not so sure. Perhaps resilience is much quieter. Perhaps it's ordinary people choosing to live, laugh, work, and hope despite circumstances most of us can scarcely imagine. The vehicles we delivered mattered. They will transport supplies, evacuate casualties, support people close to the front. They may help save lives, but the thing I will remember most isn't the vehicles, it's the people. The volunteers who drove them, the people who received them. Petrucho, the postman who became a soldier. Vova and Marina who opened their home to me. The people shopping during an air raid alert. The families on the banks of the Dnipro, the people who simply carried on. I went to Ukraine to deliver a vehicle. I came home having discovered something much bigger. That even in the middle of a war, life continues. Friendship continues, kindness continues, hope continues, and sometimes hope arrives on four wheels. 3 days, 7 countries, 1,318 miles. Driving Hope, Convoy 62, July 2026. Thank you to everyone who donated, prepared and drove the vehicles, and to the people in Ukraine who welcomed us along the way.
May the force be with you. Slava Ukraini.